Between 1923 and 1947, the Thornebrook Institute for Exceptional Children in Savannah, Georgia, reported 43 unexplained deaths among its residents. The children arrived by train in the dead of night, their small faces pressed against rain-streaked windows as they gazed upon the imposing Gothic Revival mansion that would become their final home. Parents had been told their difficult children would receive the finest care, the most advanced treatments available in the American South. What they couldn't know was that behind the manicured gardens and wrought-iron gates of the Thornebrook Institute, a systematic campaign of medical experimentation and deliberate neglect was claiming young lives with disturbing regularity. The official cause of death was always the same: complications from their existing conditions. But the unmarked graves in the Institute's private cemetery told a different story entirely. The institution's reputation, the Thornebrook Institute for Exceptional Children, stood as a monument to progressive childcare in 1920s Georgia, its red brick facade and towering spires rising above the moss-draped oaks of Savannah's Garden District. Dr. Edmund Thornebrook had established the facility in 1919 with the stated mission of providing specialized care for children with developmental disabilities, mental illness, and behavioral disorders. To the wealthy families of the South, it represented hope, a place where their problem children could receive treatment away from public scrutiny, while maintaining the family's social standing in their respective communities. Dr. E. Thornebrook himself was a figure of considerable respect in Georgia medical circles. Born in Charleston in 1878 to a family of modest means, he had overcome significant financial obstacles to earn his medical degree from Johns Hopkins University in 1903. His academic excellence earned him the opportunity to complete advanced studies in pediatric neurology at the University of Vienna under the tutelage of renowned Austrian physicians who were pioneering new approaches to treating childhood mental disorders. Upon his return to the United States in 1907, Dr. Thornebrook established a private practice in Charleston, specializing in what was then called nervous disorders of childhood. His published papers on childhood mental disorders appeared in prestigious journals, including the American Journal of Psychiatry and the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease. His groundbreaking work on environmental factors in childhood behavioral abnormalities was cited by researchers throughout the United States and Europe. His lectures at the Medical College of Georgia drew standing-room-only crowds of physicians eager to learn about his innovative treatment methodologies. When he announced his intention to establish a residential treatment facility for exceptional children in 1918, philanthropists and prominent families throughout the South lined up to fund the venture. The site selected for the institute was a sprawling 200-acre estate in Savannah's most prestigious district, purchased from the estate of tobacco magnate William Harris. The property included the original antebellum mansion, which Dr. Thornebrook extensively renovated to serve as the main residential facility, as well as several outbuildings that were converted into specialized treatment areas. The renovation costs exceeded $150,000, equivalent to more than $2 million today, and were funded entirely through private donations from wealthy families who saw the institute as both a philanthropic endeavor and a practical solution to their own family challenges. The institute opened its doors on October 15, 1919, with capacity for 50 children ranging in age from 6 to 16. The facility boasted state-of-the-art medical equipment imported from Germany and Austria, spacious dormitories furnished with the finest materials available, and educational facilities that rivaled the most exclusive private schools in the region. Dr. Thornebrook recruited a staff of 23 professionals, including nurses trained at prestigious institutions like Johns Hopkins and Massachusetts General Hospital, teachers with advanced degrees from leading universities, and orderlies selected for their experience working with difficult cases at respected institutions in Atlanta, Charleston, and Richmond. The monthly fee of $200, equivalent to nearly $3,000 in today's currency, ensured that only Georgia's most affluent families could afford placement at the institute. This pricing strategy served multiple purposes. It generated substantial revenue for the facility's operations, created an aura of exclusivity that enhanced the institute's reputation and guaranteed that the children admitted would come from families with significant social and political influence who were unlikely to cause trouble for the administration. Dr. Thornebrook understood that wealthy families were often more concerned with discretion than with detailed oversight of their children's treatment. The admissions process was carefully designed to identify children whose families would be most grateful for the Institute's services. Dr. Thornebrook personally interviewed each prospective resident and their parents, demonstrating a remarkable ability to understand family dynamics and identify the sources of shame and frustration that led parents to seek institutional placement. He had particular success with families whose children exhibited behaviors that challenged social expectations, girls who showed excessive independence or intellectual curiosity, boys who demonstrated sensitivity or artistic inclinations, and any child whose developmental differences might reflect poorly on their family's social standing. Margaret Wells, whose daughter Catherine had been admitted in 1920, later wrote extensively in her diary about the relief she felt after meeting with Dr. Thornebrook. He understood immediately the burden that Catherine's condition placed on our family, Wells wrote. Her episodes of what he called inappropriate emotional expression had become increasingly difficult to manage at home. Dr. Thornebrook assured us that Catherine would receive individual attention from qualified professionals who specialized in correcting such behavioral abnormalities. The dormitories were clean and well appointed, with large windows overlooking beautifully maintained gardens. I felt such profound relief knowing she would be properly cared for by people who understood her condition. Like most parents, Wells was encouraged to limit visits to once monthly, allowing the staff to focus on treatment without emotional disruptions that might interfere with therapeutic progress. Dr. Thornebrook explained that children with behavioral disorders often experience setbacks when reminded of their previous environment, and that consistent routine was essential for successful treatment. Parents were also discouraged from maintaining correspondence with their children during the initial treatment period, which Dr. Thornebrook said typically lasted 6 to 8 months. The Institute's reputation grew through carefully managed publicity campaigns that highlighted Dr. Thornebrook's innovative approaches to treating childhood disorders. Local newspapers featured regular articles about the facility's success stories, though these accounts were notably vague about specific treatment methods. The Savannah Morning News published a glowing profile in 1921, describing the facility as a beacon of hope for families struggling with the burden of exceptional children who require specialized intervention beyond what traditional educational institutions can provide. Photographs accompanying these articles showed children engaged in educational activities, tending the Institute's extensive gardens and participating in supervised recreational activities. The children in these carefully staged images appeared healthy, well-dressed, and contentedly occupied with their assigned tasks. What the photographs did not show were the locked wards in the basement of the main building, the isolation rooms used for what Dr. Thornebrook termed corrective conditioning, or the private cemetery hidden in the woods behind the facility where wooden markers bearing only initials and dates marked the graves of children whose treatments had proved unsuccessful. Dr. Thornebrook cultivated relationships with influential figures throughout Georgia and the broader South, understanding that political connections were essential for maintaining the Institute's independence from government oversight. Governor Thomas Hardwick visited the facility in 1922, accompanied by several state legislators and members of the Georgia Medical Association. Following a carefully orchestrated tour that showcased the Institute's most impressive facilities and most cooperative residents, Governor Hardwick issued a widely published statement praising the facility's humanitarian mission and Dr. Thornebrook's dedication to advancing the scientific understanding of childhood behavioral disorders. The Georgia Medical Association awarded Dr. Souse Thornebrook its Distinguished Service Medal in 1923, recognizing his pioneering contributions to the treatment of exceptional children and his commitment to advancing medical knowledge through innovative research methodologies. The award ceremony was attended by prominent physicians from throughout the Southeast, many of whom expressed interest in collaborating with Dr. Thornebrook on research projects that might benefit from the controlled environment and diverse patient population available at the Institute. Wealthy benefactors continued to fund expansions to the facility throughout the early 1920s. The original mansion was supplemented by additional dormitories designed to house children with different types of conditions, a new medical wing equipped with the latest diagnostic and treatment equipment, and specialized facilities for what Dr. Thornebrook described as advanced therapeutic interventions. The total investment in the facility exceeded $400,000 by 1924, making it one of the most expensive medical facilities in the American South. The Institute's medical practices were presented to parents and the medical community as cutting-edge treatments based on the latest European research. Dr. Thornebrook claimed to employ innovative techniques including hydrotherapy, occupational therapy, specialized dietary interventions, and what he termed corrective behavioral modification through environmental conditioning. Parents received monthly reports detailing their children's progress, though these documents were deliberately vague about specific treatments and focused instead on general observations about behavioral improvements and adaptation to institutional life. A typical report might read, "Catherine continues to respond favorably to our therapeutic interventions. Her episodes of emotional instability have decreased markedly over the past month, and she shows improved compliance with daily routines and institutional expectations. We are continuing to adjust her treatment regimen based on her individual responses and expect to see continued progress in the coming weeks. We recommend maintaining the current visiting restrictions to avoid disrupting her therapeutic progress." Staff turnover at the Institute was surprisingly high for such a prestigious facility, though Dr. Thornebrook explained this as the natural result of his exacting standards and the emotionally demanding nature of working with severely disturbed children. Former employees who left the Institute typically relocated to other cities shortly after their departure, and few maintained contact with colleagues or former patients' families. Those who remained at the Institute for extended periods spoke of Dr. Thornebrook with a mixture of professional respect and something that careful observers noted looked suspiciously like fear. The children themselves were rarely seen by outsiders, as the Institute's grounds were surrounded by high walls topped with decorative but effective iron spikes that Dr. Thornebrook said were necessary to prevent residents from wandering off during episodes of confusion or distress. Visitors were restricted to specific areas of the facility, and visiting hours were strictly regulated to minimize disruption to treatment schedules. Parents were told that maintaining consistent routine was crucial for their children's progress, and unexpected visits were strongly discouraged as potentially harmful to therapeutic outcomes. When children did appear in public during supervised outings to downtown Savannah, they were notably quiet and compliant, walking in orderly lines behind their chaperones and responding to questions from curious observers with polite but brief answers. That seemed carefully rehearsed. Local residents who encountered these groups often commented on how well-behaved and respectful the Institute's children appeared, attributing this to the quality of care and discipline they received at the facility. Financial records from the Institute's early years show that Dr. Thornebrook lived quite lavishly, maintaining elegant homes in both Savannah and Charleston, as well as a yacht moored at the exclusive Savannah Yacht Club. His wife, Eleanor, was known throughout Georgia society for hosting elaborate social gatherings that drew the state's political and social elite. The couple had no children of their own, a fact that Dr. Thornebrook often mentioned when speaking with prospective parents, explaining that this allowed him to devote his complete attention and emotional investment to the children entrusted to his care. By 1923, the Thornebrook Institute had achieved everything Dr. Thornebrook had envisioned when he first proposed the facility: social prestige that extended throughout the Southeast, financial success that supported both the facility's operations and his personal lifestyle, and complete freedom from outside interference in his treatment methods. The facility consistently operated at full capacity, with a waiting list of prospective admissions that allowed Dr. Thornebrook to be increasingly selective about which children he accepted for treatment. Dr. Thornebrook's reputation extended well beyond Georgia's borders, and he received inquiries from families as far away as Virginia, Tennessee, and the Carolinas. His lectures at medical conferences drew large audiences of physicians interested in his innovative approaches to treating childhood behavioral disorders. His published research was cited by medical professionals throughout the United States and Europe, and he was invited to participate in international conferences on pediatric medicine and psychology. What none of these families, colleagues, or admirers knew was that their children's names were already being carved into simple wooden markers for a private cemetery hidden in the woods behind the institute. The markers bore only initials and dates, arranged in neat rows beneath the canopy of ancient oaks that had shaded the property for more than a century. Dr. Thornebrook personally supervised the placement of these markers, consulting a leather-bound ledger that contained the real records of the Thornebrook Institute, records that detailed not therapeutic progress, but experimental procedures, not behavioral improvements, but systematic abuse, and not successful treatments, but documented evidence of medical experimentation that would horrify the civilized world if it were ever discovered. The public face of the institution remained spotless throughout the early 1920s. Local newspapers continued to publish favorable coverage of the institute's work, and donations from wealthy benefactors funded additional expansions and improvements to the facility. Dr. Thornebrook's lectures drew increasingly large audiences, and his published papers gained international attention from medical professionals interested in advancing the scientific understanding of childhood mental disorders. Behind the iron gates of the institute, however, a different kind of work was beginning in earnest, work that had nothing to do with treating childhood behavioral problems and everything to do with studying the limits of human endurance, the effects of various experimental procedures on developing minds, and the systematic documentation of suffering that Dr. Thornebrook believed would advance medical knowledge in ways that conventional research could never achieve. This work would ultimately claim the lives of dozens of Georgia's most vulnerable children, while their families paid handsomely for the privilege of never seeing them again and never knowing the terrible truth about what had been done to them in the name of medical science. Ignored signs. The first warning signs of systematic problems at the Thornebrook Institute emerged in late 1923, though they were consistently dismissed by state authorities as unfortunate but inevitable consequences of caring for severely disabled children whose conditions were inherently unpredictable and often fatal. The death rate at the institute had begun to exceed state averages for similar facilities by a significant margin, but Dr. Thornebrook's detailed explanations and impeccable reputation ensured that his accounts were accepted without serious investigation by Georgia's medical establishment or state oversight agencies. Thomas Lambert, a supply clerk who worked at the institute from October 1923 to March 1924, later told federal investigators that he had noticed disturbing irregularities almost immediately after his hiring. Lambert had previously worked at medical facilities in Atlanta and Charleston, giving him a baseline for comparison that made the institute's unusual practices immediately apparent. The medical supply orders didn't make any sense for a treatment facility, Lambert recalled in a detailed 1947 deposition. We were ordering massive quantities of sedatives, restraints, and what Dr. Thornebrook called research materials, but very little in the way of educational supplies, recreational equipment, or the kinds of therapeutic materials you'd expect to see in a facility treating children with behavioral disorders. When Lambert questioned the supply orders with his supervisor, he was told that the institute's residents required intensive medical management due to the severity of their conditions. I was told that these weren't ordinary children with simple behavioral problems, Lambert remembered. They explained that Dr. Thornebrook was treating the most severe cases, children whose families had exhausted all other options and who needed constant medical supervision to prevent them from harming themselves or others. Lambert's concerns deepened when he observed the children themselves, during his deliveries to various parts of the facility. Unlike his experiences at other medical institutions, the children at the Thornebrook Institute displayed behaviors that seemed inconsistent with the official explanations of their conditions. They moved like ghosts through those hallways, he remembered in his testimony. Thin, unnaturally quiet, and always looking over their shoulders like they expected something terrible to happen at any moment. I'd worked in hospitals and other institutions before, and I'd never seen children so uniformly frightened and withdrawn. When Lambert attempted to engage several children in casual conversation during his rounds, they either failed to respond entirely or gave answers that seemed carefully rehearsed and designed to avoid providing any specific information about their experiences at the institute. It was like they'd been trained not to talk to outsiders, Lambert said. Even simple questions about their names or how long they'd been there were met with either silence or these strange, formal responses that didn't sound like they came from children. More disturbing to Lambert were the deliveries he was required to make to restricted areas of the facility that were off-limits to most staff members. These deliveries often included medical equipment that seemed inappropriate for treating childhood behavioral disorders, restraints designed for adult patients, experimental medications that Lambert had never encountered in his previous medical supply work, and what appeared to be research equipment more suited to a laboratory than a treatment facility. The first documented death that raised serious questions occurred in March 1924. 8-year-old Robert Anderson had been admitted 6 months earlier for what his parents described as excessive energy, defiance of authority, and an inability to conform to appropriate behavioral expectations. Robert's family, prominent Atlanta merchants who owned several successful businesses, had paid for premium care and expected regular updates on their son's therapeutic progress. When their monthly report failed to arrive on schedule, Robert's father, Charles Baker Anderson, traveled from Atlanta to inquire about his son's condition and to assess the effectiveness of the treatment program. Dr. Thornebrook met with Anderson personally, displaying the combination of professional authority and compassionate concern that had made him so successful in dealing with anxious parents. He expressed deep regret about Robert's sudden and unexpected decline, explaining that despite the Institute's best efforts and most advanced treatment methods, some children simply could not adapt to institutional life, regardless of the quality of care they received. Robert suffered what appeared to be a complete psychological breakdown approximately 2 weeks ago, Dr. Thornebrook explained to the grieving father. Despite our round-the-clock medical supervision and intensive therapeutic intervention, he became increasingly violent and self-destructive. We attempted every treatment protocol available, including consultation with specialists from Atlanta and Charleston, but Robert's condition continued to deteriorate rapidly. He ultimately succumbed to complications arising from self-inflicted injuries that occurred during one of his episodes, despite the constant supervision of our most experienced staff members. The death certificate, signed by Dr. Thornebrook and filed with appropriate county offices, listed the cause of death as acute psychological trauma resulting in fatal self-harm. Anderson was devastated by the news, but initially accepted Dr. Thornebrook's explanation, particularly given the doctor's reputation and the detailed medical terminology used to describe his son's condition. However, Anderson's grief soon transformed into suspicion when he demanded to see his son's body and was told that Robert had already been buried in the Institute's private cemetery, following what Dr. Thornebrook claimed was standard procedure for children who died without family present. The grieving father was shown a small wooden grave marker bearing his son's initials and death date, located in the section of the Institute's grounds that he had never seen during his previous visits. I wanted to have Robert's body moved to our family plot in Atlanta, Anderson later wrote in a detailed letter to the Georgia State Medical Board. But Dr. Thornebrook convinced me that disturbing the grave would be traumatic for the other children who had grown attached to Robert during his time at the Institute. He explained that the children had participated in a memorial service and that Robert's grave had become a place where they went to remember their friend. I was grieving and confused, and his argument seemed reasonable at the time. Similar deaths followed with disturbing regularity throughout 1924 and 1925. Helen Brooks, admitted for what her parents described as episodes of hysteria and inappropriate emotional outbursts, died in June 1924 from what Dr. Thornebrook described as complications from severe malnutrition, resulting from persistent refusal to eat despite intensive nutritional intervention and medical supervision. Dorothy Hughes, whose parents had sought treatment for her unnatural attachment to animals and rejection of appropriate feminine behaviors, succumbed to respiratory failure following an adverse reaction to therapeutic medications in August 1924. Each death was meticulously documented in official records, with detailed medical explanations that satisfied state authorities who lacked the expertise or inclination to question Dr. Thornebrook's professional judgment. The death certificates were signed by Dr. Thornebrook himself, who held the necessary medical licenses to serve as the attending physician for all institute residents. These documents were filed with appropriate county offices and forwarded to state health departments, where they were processed as routine mortality reports from a licensed medical facility. Dr. Thornebrook's reputation continued to protect him from serious scrutiny, and grieving parents were often too devastated and overwhelmed to question his expertise or demand independent verification of his explanations. The social stigma associated with having a child with behavioral problems also contributed to families' reluctance to pursue investigations that might draw additional attention to their personal circumstances. Staff members who expressed concerns about the mounting death toll faced swift and decisive dismissal from their positions. Ruth Palmer, a registered nurse who had worked at the Institute for 8 months in 1924, was terminated immediately after she questioned the frequency of medical emergencies among the children in her care. Palmer had 15 years of nursing experience at respected hospitals in Atlanta and Savannah, giving her a professional foundation for evaluating the medical practices she observed at the Institute. "I'd been nursing for 15 years when I came to work at the Institute," Palmer told a friend in a letter that was discovered decades later among her personal effects. "I'd worked with children who had serious medical conditions, and I'd seen my share of deaths in hospital settings, but I'd never seen so many children die from such varied causes in such a short period of time." When I raised these concerns with Dr. Thornebrook, he told me that working with exceptional children required special understanding and training that not everyone possessed, and that my questions demonstrated that I lacked the emotional stability necessary for this type of work. Alma's dismissal served as a warning to other staff members about the consequences of questioning the Institute's practices or Dr. Thornebrook's medical decisions. The pattern of dismissing concerned employees while retaining those who followed orders without question gradually created a staff culture that discouraged independent thinking and prioritized institutional loyalty over professional ethics. The dismissal of questioning staff served multiple purposes for Dr. Thornebrook's operation. It eliminated potential witnesses who might report concerns to outside authorities. It reinforced his image as a perfectionist who demanded the highest standards of care and professional conduct, and it created an environment where remaining staff members learned to ignore disturbing observations rather than risk their employment by asking uncomfortable questions. New employees were carefully selected not only for their professional qualifications, but also for their willingness to follow institutional protocols without question. Dr. Thornebrook had developed sophisticated techniques for evaluating job candidates' personalities and identifying individuals who would be most likely to comply with unusual requests and least likely to report concerns to external authorities. Errands who attempted to maintain closer contact with their institutionalized children encountered increasingly sophisticated obstacles designed to limit their access while maintaining the appearance of reasonable medical policies. Virginia Hayes, whose son William had been admitted to the Institute in early 1924, was told during an unscheduled visit in September that William was in strict medical isolation due to a highly contagious condition that posed serious risks to other residents and visitors. When Hayes returned the following month for her scheduled visit, She was informed by Dr. Thornebrook that William had died during the night from complications related to the illness that had necessitated his isolation. "I never got to say goodbye to my son," Hayes wrote in her diary. Dr. Thornebrook explained that it had been too dangerous to expose other families to whatever William had contracted, and that even the staff had been required to take special precautions when caring for him during his final weeks. The Institute's isolation from external oversight was nearly complete by 1925, as Dr. Thornebrook had successfully convinced state authorities that the specialized nature of his work required freedom from routine inspections that might disrupt delicate treatment protocols. State inspections became increasingly infrequent and were typically announced well in advance, allowing Dr. Thornebrook and his staff to carefully stage what visiting officials would observe during their brief tours of the facility. The children presented to inspectors were invariably the healthiest and most cooperative residents, while others were kept in secured areas of the facility under the pretext of receiving intensive medical treatment that could not be interrupted. Inspection reports consistently praised the Institute's facilities, staff qualifications, and treatment outcomes, providing Dr. Thornebrook with official documentation that supported his claims of providing exceptional care for Georgia's most challenging cases. Local law enforcement showed little interest in investigating reports of unusual activity at the Institute, particularly given Dr. Thornebrook's connections to influential families and political figures throughout the region. Sheriff Walter Green, whose own nephew had been placed at the facility for treatment of what the family described as developmental delays and behavioral problems, consistently defended Dr. Thornebrook against what he characterized as grief-driven accusations from families who couldn't accept their children's inherent limitations. The Sheriff's Department's incident reports from this period show no formal investigations of deaths at the Institute, despite the facility's mortality rate exceeding that of comparable institutions by more than 300%. When concerned citizens or former employees attempted to report suspicious activities, their complaints were typically dismissed as misunderstandings or malicious rumors spread by disgruntled former staff members. Financial records from this period reveal disturbing patterns in the Institute's operations that should have raised immediate concerns among oversight authorities. While revenue from patient fees remained steady and substantial, expenses for basic necessities like food and standard medical supplies decreased significantly after 1924. Meanwhile, expenditures for what the records cryptically described as specialized research materials and advanced therapeutic equipment increased dramatically. Dr. Thornebrook also began making regular trips to medical conferences in distant cities, often returning with unusual equipment and supplies that were delivered directly to restricted areas of the facility without going through normal procurement procedures. These materials were never inventoried in standard supply records, and their purpose was never explained to staff members who were not directly involved in what Dr. Thornebrook termed advanced research protocols. The most troubling evidence of systematic problems emerged years later in the Institute's correspondence files, which were discovered during legal proceedings following the facility's closure. Letters from parents requesting specific information about their children's conditions and treatment progress were met with increasingly standardized responses that provided no meaningful details about individual cases or therapeutic interventions. A typical form letter from this period read, "Your child continues to receive our specialized care under the direct supervision of our most qualified medical professionals. Due to the sensitive nature of their condition and the intensive treatment protocols required for their particular case, we must limit external contact to prevent disruption of their therapeutic progress. We will notify you immediately if any significant changes occur in their condition or if modifications to their treatment plan become necessary." These form responses were carefully crafted to provide reassurance while avoiding any specific information that might prompt additional questions or requests for clarification. Parents who pressed for more detailed information were told that such requests demonstrated a lack of trust in Dr. Thornebrook's professional judgment and could potentially interfere with their children's treatment outcomes. By 1926, the Thornebrook Institute had effectively become a closed system, operating beyond meaningful oversight or accountability while maintaining the external appearance of a prestigious medical facility dedicated to advancing the treatment of childhood behavioral disorders. The death toll among residents had reached levels that should have triggered immediate investigation by state and federal authorities, but Dr. Thornebrook's reputation and the Institute's carefully cultivated public image continued to shield its operations from serious scrutiny. Parents who had entrusted their children to the facility found themselves gradually excluded from any meaningful involvement in their care, while state authorities continued to accept Dr. Thornebrook's medical explanations without independent verification or investigation. The few individuals who attempted to raise concerns about the Institute's practices were systematically discredited or silenced, creating an environment where abuse could flourish without detection or interference. The stage was now set for the full implementation of Dr. Thornebrook's experimental programs, which would transform the Institute from a treatment facility into something far more sinister, a laboratory for studying human suffering, where the most vulnerable members of society would be subjected to systematic abuse and medical experimentation in the name of advancing scientific knowledge. The horrors that would be uncovered 2 decades later were already beginning to unfold behind the Institute's iron gates, hidden from public view by a carefully constructed facade of medical respectability and social prestige. Horror uncovered. The truth about the Thornebrook Institute began to emerge in the spring of 1947, when renovations to expand the facility's medical wing led to an accidental discovery that would horrify the nation and expose one of the most systematic programs of child abuse ever documented in American medical history. Construction workers, excavating the foundation for a new psychiatric research building, uncovered a cache of documents that Dr. Thornebrook had apparently intended to destroy, but had instead sealed in waterproof metal containers and buried beneath the Institute's chapel during the winter of 1946. The documents, remarkably well preserved despite decades underground, contained detailed records of medical experiments conducted on the Institute's residents between 1923 and 1947. Written in Dr. Thornebrook's precise handwriting and supplemented with photographs, charts, and technical drawings, the files revealed a systematic program of research that treated the children not as patients requiring care, but as test subjects for a variety of experimental procedures designed to study pain tolerance, psychological conditioning, the effects of various pharmaceuticals on developing minds, and what Dr. Thornebrook termed the boundaries of human adaptation under controlled stress conditions. Arthur Newman, the construction foreman who made the initial discovery, later testified before a federal grand jury about the moment when the terrible truth was first revealed. "We thought we'd hit an old septic tank or maybe some kind of utility line," Newman recalled. "But when we pried open the first metal container with our equipment, we found these leather-bound ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, along with folders full of photographs and documents. The pages were filled with notes about individual children, but they read more like laboratory reports than medical records." Newman described his growing horror as he and his crew examined the contents of multiple containers. There were photographs of children in restraints, detailed charts tracking their responses to different treatments, and what looked like scientific reports describing various experiments. Some of the photographs showed children who were obviously suffering, and the written descriptions were even worse. It was like finding evidence of some kind of horrible scientific study that had been going on for decades. The buried archives contained more than 1,200 pages of documentation spanning nearly 25 years of operations at the Institute. Each child admitted to the facility had been assigned a number, rather than being identified by name, in the experimental records, and their progress was tracked through detailed observations of their responses to various forms of physical and psychological stress. Dr. Thornebrook had methodically documented the effects of starvation, sleep deprivation, sensory isolation, exposure to extreme temperatures, and administration of experimental drugs on children ranging in age from 6 to 16. The scope and systematic nature of the experimental program was staggering. Dr. Thornebrook had divided his subjects into different categories based on their age, sex, diagnosed conditions, and family backgrounds, then subjected each group to specific types of experiments designed to test different hypotheses about human behavior and psychological development. Children from wealthy families were often used for experiments involving psychological conditioning, while those from less prominent backgrounds were more likely to be subjected to medical procedures that carried higher risks of permanent injury or death. One particularly disturbing set of documents detailed what Dr. Thornebrook called behavioral modification through systematic negative reinforcement. Children who exhibited normal childhood behaviors, crying for their parents, refusing to eat unfamiliar food, attempting to comfort other children who were obviously distressed, or asking questions about when they would be allowed to go home, were subjected to increasingly severe punishments designed to eliminate what Dr. Thornebrook characterized as primitive emotional responses that interfere with therapeutic progress. These punishments ranged from extended periods of solitary confinement in basement cells to exposure to loud noises, bright lights, or extreme temperatures for hours at a time. Children who continued to display undesirable behaviors were subjected to more intensive interventions, including administration of experimental drugs that caused severe nausea, disorientation, or temporary paralysis. Dr. Thornebrook documented these procedures with scientific detachment, noting the duration of each intervention, the subject's physiological and psychological responses, and the effectiveness of different approaches in achieving what he termed behavioral compliance. The files revealed that many of the deaths officially attributed to medical complications or pre-existing conditions were actually the direct result of experimental procedures that had gone too far or produced unexpected results. Subject DA47, identified through cross-referencing with admission records as 9-year-old Margaret Wells, had died during what Dr. Thornebrook described as testing the limits of psychological resilience through controlled trauma exposure. The experiment involved subjecting the child to a series of increasingly terrifying experiences while monitoring her physiological responses and recording her attempts to cope with the induced stress. According to Dr. Thornebrook's notes, Margaret had been chosen for this particular experiment because her admission records indicated a high level of emotional sensitivity and strong attachment to family members, characteristics that he believed would produce more pronounced responses to psychological trauma. The experiment continued for 6 weeks, during which Margaret was subjected to various forms of psychological torture designed to break down her emotional defenses and study the process of psychological collapse in real time. The official death certificate listed Margaret's cause of death as complications from severe anxiety disorder, but Dr. Thornebrook's hidden records revealed that she had actually died from cardiac arrest brought on by extreme psychological stress during the final phase of the experiment. Her body had been immediately buried in the Institute's private cemetery, and her parents were told that she had succumbed to a sudden worsening of her pre-existing mental condition despite the staff's best efforts to save her. Eugene Hoffman, a psychiatric social worker who was brought in by federal authorities to analyze the discovered documents, later wrote in his official report, "What Dr. Thornebrook had created was not a treatment facility, but a sophisticated laboratory for studying human suffering under controlled conditions." The children were selected specifically because their families were unlikely to maintain close contact or ask detailed questions about their treatment, giving him the freedom to conduct experiments that would have been impossible in any legitimate medical setting. Hoffman's analysis revealed that Dr. Thornebrook had been conducting parallel experiments on different groups of children to test various hypotheses about human behavior and psychological development. Some children were subjected to sensory deprivation experiments designed to study the effects of isolation on developing minds. Others were used to test the limits of physical endurance through controlled starvation, sleep deprivation, or exposure to painful stimuli. Still others served as subjects for pharmaceutical experiments involving drugs that had never been tested on children or approved for human use. The most horrifying discovery came when federal investigators matched the experimental records against the grave markers in the Institute's private cemetery. Of the 43 children whose deaths had been officially recorded between 1923 and 1947, at least 38 appeared to have died as direct results of Dr. Thornebrook's experiments. The remaining 5 had apparently died from neglect after becoming too physically or mentally damaged to serve as useful test subjects for further research. Marie Douglas, who had worked as a night orderly at the Institute from 1940 to 1945, came forward after news of the discovery broke in local newspapers. Her testimony provided crucial insight into the daily operations of the facility during its final years and corroborated many of the details found in the buried documents. The children were kept in different areas of the building, depending on what doctor Thornebrook was studying at any given time, she recalled, during her interview with federal investigators. Douglas described a complex system of segregation that divided the Institute's residents based on their assigned roles in various experimental protocols. Some children were kept in isolation cells in the basement, where they might not see another human being for weeks at a time. Others were housed in what looked like hospital rooms, but with restraints built into the beds and monitoring equipment that allowed Dr. Thornebrook to observe them without being seen. There were also children who lived in dormitory-style rooms, but were brought to special treatment areas every day for what he called therapeutic sessions. According to Douglas, Dr. Thornebrook maintained strict schedules for his experimental work, making detailed rounds every evening to check on what he called his research subjects and making extensive notes in the leather-bound ledgers that were later found buried beneath the chapel. He treated those children like laboratory animals, Douglas remembered. He would observe their responses to different treatments with the same cold scientific interest that you might see in someone studying mice or rats. There was no compassion, no recognition that these were human beings who were suffering. Douglas described witnessing procedures that had no conceivable legitimate medical purpose and were clearly designed to inflict suffering for the sake of studying human responses to trauma. I saw children being injected with substances that made them violently ill for days at a time, while Dr. Thornebrook carefully monitored their symptoms and recorded their reactions. Other children were kept awake for days at a time while he observed their psychological deterioration and documented the stages of mental breakdown that resulted from sleep deprivation. The systematic disposal of evidence was another crucial aspect of Dr. Thornebrook's operation that Douglas's testimony helped to illuminate. When children died, their bodies were removed immediately and buried in the cemetery behind the main building before dawn the next morning. Their personal belongings were burned in the Institute's incinerator, and their names were never mentioned again by staff members. It was like they had never existed at all. The discovery of the buried documents prompted a broader federal investigation into the Institute's operations, led by the FBI and involving medical experts, psychiatric professionals, and legal specialists from multiple agencies. State authorities, belatedly recognizing the scope of the scandal and their own failure to provide adequate oversight, ordered a complete audit of all Institute records and facilities. What they found painted a picture of systematic abuse that had continued virtually unimpeded for more than 2 decades. Physical evidence throughout the Institute corroborated the documentary findings in horrifying detail. The basement of the main building contained a series of cells that had been used for solitary confinement, equipped with restraints and monitoring equipment that allowed Dr. Thornebrook to observe subjects without being seen. The cells showed evidence of long-term use, with scratch marks on the walls where children had apparently tried to claw their way out, and stains that forensic analysis later confirmed to be human blood. A concealed room behind the medical dispensary contained supplies of experimental drugs, including several compounds that had never been approved for human use and others that were known to be extremely dangerous when administered to children. Many of these substances had been obtained through Dr. Thornebrook's contacts with pharmaceutical companies and university research programs, often under false pretenses or through misrepresentation of their intended use. The investigation also revealed that Dr. Thornebrook had been in regular contact with researchers at other institutions throughout the United States and Europe, sharing data from his experiments through an informal network of doctors and scientists interested in what they euphemistically termed boundary research, or unrestricted human studies. Letters found in his personal files showed that he had been providing detailed reports on his findings to colleagues in Atlanta, Charleston, Baltimore, and as far away as Vienna and Berlin. These correspondence records revealed that Dr. Thornebrook's work was part of a broader international effort to study human behavior and psychological development through methods that would have been considered unethical or illegal in conventional research settings. His colleagues praised his ability to conduct comprehensive longitudinal studies on subjects who were completely isolated from external influences, and several expressed interest in replicating his methods at their own institutions. Perhaps most disturbing was the discovery that Dr. Thornebrook had been receiving substantial financial support for his research from wealthy benefactors and corporate interests who were fully aware of its true nature. Corporate executives from pharmaceutical companies, weapons manufacturers, and intelligence agencies had provided funding specifically for what internal documents called unrestricted behavioral research on institutionalized subjects. These funders received regular reports on Dr. Thornebrook's findings, treating the systematic torture and murder of Georgia's most vulnerable children as a worthwhile investment in advancing scientific knowledge that might prove useful for their own purposes. The funding records showed payments totaling more than $200,000 between 1925 and 1946, equivalent to millions of dollars today, from sources including major pharmaceutical corporations interested in testing experimental drugs, military contractors developing psychological warfare techniques, and intelligence agencies seeking information about interrogation methods and psychological manipulation. Dr. Thornebrook's research was seen as particularly valuable because it provided data on how children and adolescents responded to various forms of stress and trauma, information that could potentially be applied to adult populations under different circumstances. The investigation revealed that several surviving residents of the institute were still living in Georgia and other southeastern states, many in other institutional settings where they had been transferred as they aged out of the Thornebrook facility. Federal investigators located 16 survivors between the ages of 25 and 40, though many initially refused to discuss their experiences due to trauma and fear of retribution. Those who eventually agreed to be interviewed provided heartbreaking testimony about their experiences as children at the institute. Francis Lowe, who had been admitted at age 8 in 1935 and remained at the institute until 1943, provided some of the most detailed and disturbing accounts of daily life under Dr. Thornebrook's control. He told us that our families had sent us there because we were defective and couldn't be fixed through normal methods, Lowe recalled during his interview with federal investigators. He said that the treatments we received would either correct our problems or prove that we were beyond help, in which case we would never be allowed to leave the institute because we posed a danger to normal society. Lowe described a systematic program of psychological conditioning designed to break down children's sense of identity and self-worth while making them completely dependent on Dr. Thornebrook's approval. Children who cried or asked for their parents were taken to the basement rooms, and many of them never came back upstairs. Those who did return were different, quieter, more frightened, and completely obedient to whatever the staff told them to do. We learned very quickly not to ask questions or show any emotions that might be considered inappropriate. The survivors' accounts revealed that Dr. Thornebrook had developed sophisticated techniques for selecting children for different types of experiments based on their personalities, family backgrounds, and perceived resilience. Children from wealthy families were often subjected to psychological experiments that were less likely to cause visible physical damage, while those from less prominent backgrounds were more frequently used for medical procedures that carried higher risks of permanent injury or death. Evelyn Clark, who had been a resident from 1938 to 1944, described the Institute's elaborate system of rewards and punishments that was designed to encourage cooperation with experimental procedures. Children who participated willingly in what Dr. Thornebrook called special treatments were given better food, cleaner clothes, and small privileges like access to books or time in the garden. Those who resisted were punished with isolation, reduced food rations, or what the staff called corrective procedures that were always worse than the original experiments. Clark also provided crucial information about the Institute's method of disposing of children who died during experiments. When someone died, the other children were told that they had been transferred to a special facility or had graduated from the program. But we could see the burial activities from some of the upstairs windows, and we knew what was really happening. Dr. Thornebrook would personally supervise the burials, and he always carried that leather ledger where he recorded everything that happened to us. The survivors uniformly described Dr. Thornebrook as a figure who inspired both fascination and terror among the children under his control. He could be charming and almost fatherly when he wanted to gain a child's cooperation, remembered Harold Price, who had been at the Institute from 1940 to 1946. But there was something cold and calculating in his eyes that never changed, even when he was being kind. We all understood that our lives meant nothing to him beyond their value for his research. Rice provided additional details about the Institute's classification system for experimental subjects. Children were divided into different groups based on what Dr. Thornebrook called their research potential. Some were used for drug experiments, others for psychological studies, and still others for what he called endurance testing. The staff would refer to us by numbers rather than names when discussing our assignments, and we learned to recognize which numbers were associated with which types of experiments. The public revelation of the Thornebrook Institute's true nature sent shockwaves through Georgia's medical and social communities and attracted national attention from newspapers, magazines, and radio programs. Families who had entrusted their children to Dr. Thornebrook's care decades earlier were forced to confront the horrifying reality that they had unknowingly paid for their children to be systematically tortured and killed in the name of scientific research. Margaret Wells, whose daughter Catherine had been among Dr. Thornebrook's earliest victims, was devastated when federal investigators informed her of the truth about what had happened at the Institute. "I trusted him completely," she wrote in a letter to the governor of Georgia. "He seemed so knowledgeable and compassionate, and the facility appeared to be everything he claimed it was. I never imagined that anyone could do such things to children, especially someone with his reputation and credentials." Wells's response was typical of many parents who had placed their children at the Institute. The carefully constructed facade of medical respectability had been so convincing that even direct family members had been completely deceived about the true nature of the facility's operations. The revelation that their children had been subjected to systematic abuse and experimentation rather than receiving treatment created profound guilt and trauma that many parents never fully recovered from. The discovery also raised serious questions about the broader medical and academic community's complicity in Dr. Thornebrook's work. Several prominent physicians and researchers who had corresponded with Dr. Thornebrook or cited his published research were forced to explain their relationships with him and their knowledge of his methods. While most claimed ignorance of the true nature of his experimental work, the extensive correspondence found in his files suggested that many colleagues had at least suspected that his research involved unethical practices. Dr. Raymond Elliott, a psychiatrist at Emory University, who had collaborated with Dr. Thornebrook on several published papers, testified before the federal grand jury that he had become increasingly uncomfortable with some of the data that Dr. Thornebrook provided for their joint research. The results he reported seemed too consistent and too dramatic to be plausible from conventional treatment methods, Elliott admitted. When I questioned him about his methodology, he told me that his institutional setting allowed him to implement treatment protocols that would be impossible in other environments. I should have pressed him for more specific information, but I was so impressed by his reputation that I accepted his explanations without adequate investigation. As federal investigators pieced together the full scope of the atrocities committed at the Institute over nearly 3 decades, one crucial question remained unanswered. Where was Dr. Edmund Thornebrook himself, the man who had systematically abused, tortured, and killed dozens of children, while maintaining a facade of medical respectability, had vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the buried evidence of his crimes and a legacy of trauma that would haunt survivors and their families for generations to come. Legacy and silence. Dr. Edmund Thornebrook disappeared from Savannah on April 12, 1947, just 3 days before construction workers would uncover the buried documents that exposed his decades of systematic abuse and medical experimentation. His sudden departure was not coincidental. Private correspondence discovered later revealed that he had been warned by an unknown contact about the impending construction project that would disturb his carefully concealed evidence. The warning came in the form of a telegram sent to his personal residence, containing only the words, "Foundation work begins Monday, stop. Suggest immediate departure, stop." The investigation into Dr. Thornebrook's whereabouts led federal authorities through a complex web of false identities, financial transfers, and international connections that suggested months or even years of advanced planning for his eventual escape. His bank accounts in Savannah, Charleston, and Atlanta had been systematically emptied over a period of 6 weeks prior to his disappearance, with funds transferred through a series of intermediary accounts to banks in countries that did not maintain extradition treaties with the United States. His personal residence in Savannah's historic district showed clear evidence of hasty but methodical packing, with documents burned in the fireplace and personal items selectively removed according to some predetermined plan. Neighbors reported seeing unusual activity at the house during the week before his disappearance, including the arrival of several unmarked vehicles and the removal of multiple trunks and boxes under cover of darkness. The house's staff, a cook, gardener, and housekeeper who had worked for the Thornebrook family for years, claimed they had been given unexpected vacations and were not present during the final week. Eleanor Thornebrook, his wife of 28 years, provided testimony to federal investigators that was consistent but ultimately unhelpful in determining her husband's location or his escape route. Edmund told me he was attending a medical conference in Chicago and might need to extend his trip if interesting research opportunities arose, she told agents during extensive questioning. When he didn't return after 2 weeks, I assumed he had been called away on an emergency consultation or had decided to visit colleagues in other cities. It never occurred to me that he might be fleeing from something because I had no knowledge of any problems with his work at the Institute. Eleanor's testimony was deemed credible by investigators, as extensive examination of her personal papers, financial records, and correspondence revealed no evidence that she had been involved in or aware of the experimental program at the Institute. Her shock and horror upon learning the truth about her husband's activities appeared genuine, and she cooperated fully with all aspects of the investigation. However, her inability to provide useful information about Dr. Thornebrook's escape plans or potential destinations left investigators with few leads to pursue in their search for the fugitive doctor. The Georgia State Medical Board moved quickly to contain the scandal and limit its impact on the broader medical community, but their efforts were significantly hampered by the extensive documentation that had been uncovered and the involvement of federal agencies in the investigation. The buried files provided irrefutable evidence of systematic abuse that could not be dismissed, explained away, or attributed to misunderstandings or misinterpretations of legitimate medical procedures. However, the board's official investigation was conducted largely in secret, with public statements carefully crafted to minimize the scope of Dr. Thornebrook's crimes and emphasized that he had acted as a rogue physician whose behavior was an aberration that did not reflect on the broader medical community or the state's oversight procedures. Board members repeatedly stressed that Dr. Thornebrook had possessed impeccable credentials and had maintained an exemplary public reputation that gave no indication of his true activities. Dr. Carl Bennett, chairman of the Georgia State Medical Board, issued a statement declaring that the shocking revelations about Dr. Thornebrook's activities represent the actions of a single individual who deliberately deceived colleagues, patients, and oversight authorities through an elaborate facade of legitimate medical practice. The medical community is as horrified as the general public by these discoveries, and we are committed to ensuring that such deception can never occur again through enhanced oversight and verification procedures. State authorities faced a complex dilemma in deciding how to handle the surviving victims of Dr. Thornebrook's experiments and the families of children who had died at the institute. Many of the survivors had been transferred to other institutional settings as they aged out of the Thornebrook facility, and their testimony about their experiences was often dismissed by current caregivers as the fantasies or false memories of mentally disturbed individuals who had difficulty distinguishing between reality and imagination. The state was extremely reluctant to acknowledge the full extent of the abuse that had occurred at the institute, as doing so would have exposed decades of negligent oversight and potentially opened the door to massive financial liability from lawsuits filed by survivors and victims' families. State officials also worried that extensive publicity about the case might damage Georgia's reputation and discourage investment in the state's medical and educational institutions. The families of children who had died at the institute were quietly approached by state representatives who offered modest financial settlements in exchange for signed agreements not to pursue legal action or speak publicly about their experiences. These settlement offers were typically accompanied by subtle threats about the potential consequences of prolonged legal proceedings, including unwanted publicity about their families' decision to institutionalize their children and the social stigma that might result from such revelations. Most families, devastated by the revelation of what had happened to their children and facing the prospect of expensive and emotionally draining legal battles, accepted these settlements and agreed to remain silent about their experiences. The settlement amounts varied based on the family's apparent financial resources and their perceived likelihood of pursuing independent legal action, but they were generally far below what might have been awarded in successful wrongful death lawsuits. Evelyn Clark, whose daughter Rose had died at the institute in 1938, was one of the few parents who refused the state's settlement offer and attempted to pursue both legal action and public exposure of the case. "No amount of money could compensate for what that monster did to my daughter," she wrote in a passionate letter to Georgia's governor. "But I want the world to know what happened at that place, so that no other children will ever suffer as Rose did. The people responsible for allowing this must be held accountable." Clark's efforts to publicize the case and pursue legal remedies were largely unsuccessful, as newspapers were reluctant to cover a story that implicated prominent members of Georgia's social and political establishment, and attorneys were hesitant to take on cases that involved challenging powerful institutional interests. The few news articles that did appear focused on Dr. Thornebrook's escape rather than the systematic abuse that had occurred at the institute, and they typically emphasized his apparent mental instability rather than the institutional failures that had enabled his crimes. The physical evidence of Dr. Thornebrook's crimes was systematically destroyed over the months following the initial discovery, as state and federal authorities worked to eliminate any traces of the experimental program that might inspire copycat activities or provide information that could be misused by other researchers. The Thornebrook Institute was closed permanently in September 1947, and the building was demolished the following year, despite its historical significance and architectural value. The private cemetery where dozens of children had been buried was quietly relocated, with the remains transferred to unmarked sections of public cemeteries throughout the Savannah area. The original wooden grave markers were destroyed, eliminating the most tangible evidence of the Institute's victims and making it impossible for families to locate their children's final resting places. The relocation was conducted under tight security to prevent media coverage or public demonstrations. Corporate and individual benefactors who had funded Dr. Thornebrook's research faced no legal consequences, as federal investigators were unable to prove that they had been aware of the specific nature of his experimental procedures or had intended to support illegal activities. Many of these individuals went on to establish legitimate medical research foundations and educational institutions, carefully distancing themselves from any association with the Thornebrook Institute while continuing to support what they characterized as innovative approaches to mental health treatment and scientific advancement. The pharmaceutical companies that had provided experimental drugs and equipment for Dr. Thornebrook's research claimed that they had been deceived about the intended use of their products and had assumed that all procedures were being conducted according to appropriate ethical and legal standards. Several companies made substantial donations to children's hospitals and mental health organizations, positioning these contributions as evidence of their commitment to legitimate medical research and treatment. The medical establishment's response to the Thornebrook scandal was largely defensive, focusing on damage control rather than meaningful reform of oversight procedures or research ethics. Professional journals published articles emphasizing the importance of ethical oversight in medical research, but these publications carefully avoided specific references to Dr. Thornebrook's work or detailed discussion of the systemic failures that had allowed his program to undetected for decades. Several prominent physicians who had corresponded with Dr. Thornebrook or collaborated on research projects quietly retired from practice, or relocated to positions in other states where their past associations were less likely to attract attention. Others successfully reinvented themselves as advocates for research ethics and patient protection, using their supposed shock at Dr. Thornebrook's revelations to establish new careers as experts on preventing medical abuse. Attempts by journalists and independent researchers to investigate the broader network of institutions that had collaborated with Dr. Thornebrook met with consistent stonewalling from medical administrators, university officials, and government agencies. Records were declared lost or destroyed, former employees proved impossible to locate, and institutional administrators claimed no knowledge of any collaborative research programs or exchanges of information with the Thornebrook Institute. The impression that emerged from these investigations was that Dr. Thornebrook's work had been an isolated aberration rather than part of a broader pattern of experimental abuse or unethical research practices. This narrative was actively promoted by medical and academic institutions that had reasons to avoid scrutiny of their own research programs and oversight procedures during the same period. The few survivors of the Thornebrook Institute who attempted to tell their stories publicly faced systematic discrediting by authorities and medical professionals who questioned their credibility and the accuracy of their memories. Their accounts of the experimental procedures they had endured were characterized as delusions, false memories, or exaggerations created by their histories of mental illness and institutionalization. Louise Ellis, who had been a resident of the Institute from 1941 to 1946, made several determined attempts to document her experiences and those of other survivors through written accounts and public speaking engagements. Her efforts to interest publishers in her story were consistently unsuccessful, as editors expressed concerns about potential legal liability and questioned the reliability of her memory given her background as a former mental patient. "They told me that my story was too disturbing to be believable," Ellis later wrote in her private journal. "No one wanted to accept that such things could happen to children in America, especially in a place that was supposed to help them. The few people who did listen to me suggested that I might be confusing memories of legitimate medical treatment with fantasies created by mental illness." Ellis's experience was typical of the treatment that survivors received when they attempted to seek justice or public recognition of their suffering. The combination of social stigma associated with mental illness, skepticism about recovered memories of childhood trauma, and institutional pressure to maintain silence created an environment where survivor testimony was systematically discredited and dismissed. The official record of the Thornebrook Institute was carefully sanitized in the years following its closure, with state documents emphasizing Dr. Thornebrook's previously unblemished reputation and characterizing the experimental program as an unexpected deviation from legitimate medical practice that could not have been predicted or prevented through normal oversight procedures. The number of children who had died at the Institute was consistently underestimated in official reports, and the circumstances of their deaths were described in vague medical terminology that obscured the systematic nature of the abuse they had suffered. References to the experimental program were minimized, and the focus was shifted to Dr. Thornebrook's apparent mental instability and his deception of well-intentioned colleagues and oversight authorities. By 1950, the Thornebrook Institute had largely disappeared from public memory and official records. The site where the facility had stood was sold to commercial developers who constructed a shopping center, erasing the last physical traces of Dr. Thornebrook's experimental program. Local newspapers ceased covering the story, and references to the institute gradually disappeared from medical literature and historical accounts of Georgia's institutional history. Dr. Thornebrook himself was never located despite extensive efforts by federal authorities and international law enforcement agencies. Unconfirmed reports placed him in various South American countries, where several Nazi war criminals had also fled following World War I. Some investigators speculated that his experimental techniques and research data had proven valuable to intelligence agencies seeking information about psychological manipulation and human conditioning. But these theories were never substantiated through official investigations. The most persistent theory about Dr. Thornebrook's disappearance was that he had been extracted by intelligence agencies who valued his research enough to provide him with a new identity and comfortable exile in exchange for his cooperation in developing psychological warfare techniques. This theory was supported by the sophisticated nature of his escape plan and the apparent advance warning he received about the construction project that would expose his crimes. The legacy of the Thornebrook Institute remained buried for decades, known only to the dwindling number of survivors and family members who had been sworn to secrecy by legal agreements or intimidated into silence by social pressure and threats of legal retaliation. The children who had died at the facility remained anonymous, their stories untold, and their suffering unacknowledged by the state that had failed to protect them. In 1975, nearly 30 years after the Institute's closure, Martha Steele, one of the last surviving residents, made a final, determined attempt to document what had happened there and ensure that the victims would not be completely forgotten. Her manuscript, titled The Children Doctor, Thornebrook Forgot, was completed shortly before her death from cancer at age 42, but it was never published and disappeared from her estate under mysterious circumstances. Steele's nephew, who inherited her personal effects, reported that the manuscript had been present when he first examined her belongings, but was missing when he returned to collect them several days later. Other personal papers related to her time at the Institute had also disappeared, leaving no trace of her efforts to preserve the historical record of the abuse that had occurred there. Today, more than 75 years after the Thornebrook Institute opened its doors, few traces remain of Dr. Edmund Thornebrook's systematic program of child abuse and medical experimentation. The shopping center that stands on the facility's former site shows no indication of the horrors that once occurred there, and shoppers browse stores and restaurants unaware that they are walking over ground where dozens of children suffered and died in the name of scientific research. The scattered graves of Dr. Thornebrook's victims lie unmarked in public cemeteries throughout the Savannah area, their identities lost, and their stories silenced by decades of institutional cover-up and deliberate forgetting. The man who tortured and killed them lived out his days in comfortable exile, protected by powerful interests that valued his research more than the lives of the children he destroyed. The silence surrounding the Thornebrook Institute serves as a stark reminder that institutional abuse can flourish when society chooses to look away, and that the most vulnerable members of our communities remain at risk when oversight fails and accountability is abandoned in favor of protecting institutional reputations and powerful interests. The children who died at Dr. Thornebrook's hands were forgotten twice, first by the families who institutionalized them to avoid social embarrassment, and then by the state that allowed their suffering to be covered up and their stories to be erased from history. The case of the Thornebrook Institute demonstrates how easily systematic abuse can be concealed behind facades of respectability and scientific legitimacy, and how institutional loyalty and professional self-interest can combine to silence victims and protect perpetrators. The failure to hold anyone other than the escaped Dr. Thornebrook accountable for these crimes ensured that similar abuses could elsewhere, hidden behind the same combination of social prestige, professional authority, and deliberate ignorance that had protected the Institute for nearly 3 decades. Perhaps most disturbing is the realization that the Thornebrook Institute's crimes were enabled not by a breakdown of oversight systems, but by their deliberate manipulation by individuals who understood how to exploit society's willingness to ignore the suffering of marginalized populations. The children who died there were victims not just of Dr. Thornebrook's sadism, but of a broader social system that valued institutional reputation over individual lives and preferred comfortable lies to uncomfortable truths. If this story impacted you, if you stayed until the end, it's because you feel these hidden truths also need to be exposed. So leave in the comments the city you're watching from. This way we can see how far these stories are reaching. And subscribe to the channel. There are many other cases the world tried to forget, but we insist on remembering.